Welcome to the Sustainable Living Podcast. Tips, tools, and tactics for living a heart-centered life that honors Mother Earth and her inhabitants. The information shared on the Sustainable Living Podcast reflects the opinions of host Marian West, Janice Friant, and their guests. Please use your own discretion in research before applying any information to your individual situation. Now, here are your hosts, Marian and Janice.
Hello, everyone. This is your host, Marianne West, and I'm here with Grace Gershuny. Grace is an author among many, many other things, but that's how we met. She wrote a book called The Organic Revolutionary, and I had the pleasure to meet Grace in person when she was on a book tour out here in California, and I'm so excited to have her on the podcast and that you all get to know her. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you for hosting me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Grace, I'm sorry, I still have that cold, so you're going to hear my voice just being off a little bit. So I'm very sorry about that. Grace, you wrote this book, The Organic Revolutionary, because you were actually instrumental in writing the organic standards for the USDA. There was a whole lot of pain involved in that, it seems, judging from your book.
Yes.
And I thought maybe we go a little bit into that now, if you wish, or we can start out talking about how you got to that place to even end up in Washington. What would you like to do?
Well, I think we can do a little bit of both.
Okay.
Certainly, I wrote the book in large part because so many people have no clue what actually happened in terms of translating the work of many, many organic farmers and activists and advocates over many years into federal regulations, and have a lot of misconceptions about that. And I grappled with it for several years, 15 years really, to try to find a way to tell the story that at both challenges the prevailing notion of USDA took organic and watered down the standards so that big agribusiness companies could take it over sort of narrative, and put it in a personal story that really talks about how organic has evolved over a century, and how the whole activist community has had many differing notions of it, but that it's really a revolutionary movement, and it has the potential to really make changes not just in the food system, but in society as a whole. So I subtitled the book, A Memoir of the Movement for Real Food, Planetary Healing, and Human Liberation. And that might sound extremely presumptuous, and it is a bit presumptuous, but that's really the presumptuousness of the movement, not my personal presumptuousness. So
yeah, you get no argument from me, because I totally believe that we need to change the system as we know it today, which leads to so many different injustices and problems for us. Talk about water, soil, which soil is one of your big topics as well. And I also wanted to say here before we go any further that I thought I knew a lot about organic, and I definitely learned a lot about the movement and the history. There were some things in there which were almost shocking to me, and you might probably get there, but in the origins that there were some quite right-wing origins of the organic movement. Mm-hmm. And I also was somebody who definitely had misconception. I'm actually going to ask you a question on that later as well. So, a memoir. So please continue. I'm sorry. I totally interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I appreciate that. And I think that the need to really tell that story in personal terms, I think breaks down some of the ideological blinders that many of us tend to have, myself included. I mean, I really have to challenge my own assumptions in working with much of this material. So I was an organic activist and an advocate. I went back to the land after growing up in the city, and in the early 70s moved to Vermont and started my first garden, and was totally hooked on it, learned all I could, and got involved with the organic farming movement that was just beginning in its modern incarnation with that back to the land movement in the Northeast and also on the West Coast, as you know. So getting more deeply involved in questioning things, I ended up getting asked to help put together the first organic certification program for NOFA, which is now the Northeast Organic Farming Association. At that time, it was just a Vermont and New Hampshire, very small organization. And from that experience, a great deal emerged, and eventually I ended up getting drafted by USDA to come write the regulations in the mid-90s when they finally got some funding to implement the organic law. But in the meantime, I had been involved in a lot of different projects to try to advance organic farming, and then found that writing regulations was a whole different thing. But the folks that recruited me because they knew that I was dedicated to the principles of organic agriculture, which I still am and always will be, and that I also was a voice for real food system change, the desire to really transform the food system. And I saw the possibility of introducing organic as a legitimate field of endeavor within USDA, which had, strongly opposed any such idea, to be a foot in the door to change a lot of thinking. It would make it necessary for any organic or USDA service providers, like the Extension Service, which helps teach people about the latest in agricultural practices and good management. It would make it necessary for them to also include organic practices in their toolbox. And up until that point, most USDA service providers would laugh at organic farmers. Oh, that's unscientific. That is outmoded. And get with the program of chemicals and GMOs and stuff like that. So
do you think that was the motivation to originally, when NOFA originally started to recruit you for writing standards, people wanted to be taken more serious, or what do you think was the original motivation for you?
Well, I think ultimately the motivation was to bring some credibility to the marketplace. And that's still really what the organic label is about. The organic regulations are a marketing program and not a Bible. And so even back in the radical 60s and 70s, one of the key insights I relate in my book is that after a while, these idealistic, cooperative-oriented grow food to feed the guerrillas in the cities who were going to feed the revolution, folks realized that they couldn't make money growing vegetables. They had to sell them. And this is one of those contradictions. Even if you're anti-capitalist, which I am, you can't, unless you have a trust fund or something from your relatives, you can't really do much in this capitalist dominated world without engaging in some kind of marketing.
Yeah, for sure. I'm drawing the parallels now to the permaculture movement which people are very much into being stewards of the earth and so forth. But there's a whole group which says, everything should be free. But as long as not everything is free, people engaging need to still eat and sleep somewhere and do all of that. Yeah. Making money is part of the equation. That's for sure.
Yeah. So at any rate, I'm not sure where I was going with that discussion.
Maybe this is a good time to bring up TREC, TREC, and what came out of that.
Okay. Well, that kind of walks us into the next stage of my biographical story. So one of the founders of NOFA was Samuel Kamen, and he was a huge influence on many of our thinking, and he still is. He's still kicking. And Samuel was really good at promulgating the ideas of the organic movement and had moved on when he stopped running NOFA to found an organization to teach rural skills and the essentials of organic and alternative agriculture in southern New Hampshire, which he called the Rural Education Center, otherwise known as TREC. And at the time, I had gone back to graduate school. The University of Vermont was very focused on the idea of maybe becoming a farm consultant and helping people who wanted to use more organic practices to do that. That's part of why I wrote the little handbook, which I was still working on, which later became the book The Soul of Soil, which is still in print and which I'm very proud of. Anyway, I was looking for a final independent study opportunity, an internship sort of thing to help me finish my graduate program. And Samuel agreed to hire me at the Rural Education Center as the garden supervisor and supervising the solar greenhouse and all kinds of experimental stuff. I mean, they had incredible speakers and teachers there. I think Bill Mollison, the founder of permaculture, did one of the first North American intensives at the Rural Education Center there in New Hampshire, and many others, and especially a lot of biodynamic teachers came through there, since that particular spot was, in fact, and still is, center of the biodynamic and anthroposophic community in southern New Hampshire. So it was an incredibly rich environment. I learned a ton during that time, but it was still very dependent on grant funding and, going around looking for handouts from rich people and stuff like that, which Samuel was good at, but he hated. So put together a plan with some other members of our board of directors to produce a cottage industry to make yogurt, which Samuel and his wife Louise had actually been making themselves previously and selling door to door in the community, and it was really outstanding yogurt. And he said, well, we've got a couple of Jersey cows here, and we want to teach our students about cottage industries and yogurt making, and we can turn it into some kind of business that maybe could support our little teaching endeavors. And so he and one of the board members, Gary Hirschberg, put together a business plan, and I was going to grow the fruits to use to flavor the yogurt, and they decided to name the company after the farm that we were managing there, which was pretty worn out, rocky farm, and it was called Stonyfield Farm. And this might be a label with which your listeners are familiar.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It's huge. It became huge.
Yeah.
Now, you actually had already experience in the cottage industry, because when you were back in Vermont, did you start the farmers market or did you participate in it? And then I think you also were part of doing like a cottage pickle industry.
Yeah. My previous a year or two after I had my first garden, I was tapped to help organize a farmer's market, which I thought was a really good idea because I had already discovered that one couldn't make a living growing vegetables. One had to sell them, and there was no place to sell them. That was kind of my first real organizing job, and it was a really real eye-opener. Really, the whole farmers market movement, of course, has taken off thanks to organizations like NOFA and I assume CCOF and other California organizations that promoted the idea of local food for local markets at the time. So that was really my first exposure to that world of organizing. And a little bit later, there was a grant-funded community cannery project set up in my neighborhood where I was employed to grow some of the food that would be used as a way to subsidize the low income, food hub sort of operation that was well ahead of current day talks about and projects for community food centers. And that project also got me thinking about, well, what the heck does this organic label on our dilly beans really mean? I didn't think that the garden project was particularly well thought out. I was hired to manage the garden, but we had a bunch of raw chicken manure dumped on this worn out old hayfield and plowed in, and I thought, well, I already knew enough about soil to know that really wasn't the best thing in the world. So, what should it really mean? And that's really what got me interested in helping write the certification standards a couple of years later. So it all sort of fit together for me.
Right. So I have a kind of naive question which has nothing to do with your book, and just because I don't know the history of this country that much. So was it common in the olden days to have farmers market here in the US, or was it more not so common? Because in Germany, they're still going strong. Like I grew up with, twice a week markets of farmers coming in and selling their stuff.
Well, that's a really good point, because I don't know how, going back into earlier history, I believe that they were probably more common in many places than they are today. But by the 60s and early 70s, they very, very rare, and there were a few places where they existed. Mostly it was privately owned farm stands, I believe. But I think that the idea of supermarkets and also the production of market gardening in a lot of places sort of disappeared, and in favor of large tracts of monoculture vegetables of one kind or another that were then shipped to the supermarkets.
Yeah. And probably the consumers really got used to having strawberries all year too, like when you have a farmer's market, it's more seasonal. Yeah. So, and still, I'm still picking your brain on farmers markets here, just because I'm, really interested in that. And when I had my children here, I used to travel far to get to the one farmer's market, which was around the area. And now they're very common, but it seems they used to be more hippie farmer, back to the land oriented. And now they're almost more like yuppie markets, at least here in California. But, now everything seems very expensive. And when I first started going, I used to go because you cut out the middleman and you could buy direct from the farmer. You could get a box of number 2 apples with little spots in it for choosing for a really good price. And that doesn't seem to be that way anymore.
It is different. I think it's different in different places. In less affluent communities, I think it's still more of the way you describe it, how it used to be in California. Certainly around where I live in northeastern Vermont, which is one of the poorest parts of this very rural state, it's still very friendly, and it's never cheap. And I think a lot of people have an expectation that, if you're cutting out the middleman, it should be a lot cheaper, but it still requires a lot of time and effort by the farmer to prepare stuff for retail sale, as opposed to just dropping off a case of broccoli at the supermarket. So I think that there are a lot of variations still in farmers markets. There's some farmers markets still, I think, that they don't particularly care if you're, buying in produce from somewhere else and just selling it there. There are other farmers markets that have strict requirements that only the producer can be here selling. Other markets that only want organic products. to be sold and others where they don't care whatever as long as you're labeling it accurately. And it's really all over the place. It really is very local sort of phenomenon. You just have to know what the deal is there. And things have changed also in terms of what's available in grocery stores. I mean, if you think about it, certainly in this country, our eating habits have changed so much that back when you were growing up in Germany, you probably your parents probably liked having fresh produce as much as possible. And a lot of us who grew up here, never even had any inkling of fresh produce. It was canned or frozen vegetables, and people were not accustomed to going to buy their produce fresh, and the supermarkets had very little that was any good. A lot of times the farmers markets were started just so that people could be able to have fresh produce that was all really nice. And
yeah, I think that's part now of the social justice movement to try to get farmers market into food deserts, into poorer areas, usually in larger cities where there is just no good food available. Yeah. So for sure. So let's come back. So you did a graduate program, and what is your title?
I have a master's degree in extension education, which is a program I don't think it's no longer offered at the University of Vermont where I went, and I was chastised for engaging in something that was called a terminal degree, which, didn't kill me. But it was a great program for me because it allowed me to basically do whatever I wanted in the general field of agriculture. I had very few required courses, and it was aimed at people who were going to be working with adult learners in any field of endeavor, but of course concentrated on agriculture. And it was very well suited for what I was interested in. So, I took soil science courses, and I took economics courses, and I did a lot of independent study, and that was definitely my preference and still is the way I prefer to work with students.
So you have students still. So would you expand a little bit on your teaching you're doing right now?
I've been a teacher pretty much from the time I got out of my graduate program and started giving workshops at conferences about soil usually, and then got more involved with a field called social ecology, which I talk about in my book, and started teaching more extended programs in a broader range of topics about more general food system issues in a summer program, and eventually got to be a faculty member at Goddard College here in Vermont, which was a wonderful experience. And I've had different teaching gigs since then, all on an adjunct level, and have taught at Sterling College and Prescott College, and now for the past 5 years have been teaching in an online master's program in sustainable food systems for Green Mountain College in Poultney, Vermont. And that's a great program. The biggest drawback for me is that it's pretty much all online. I rarely get to see anybody in person, let alone my students. And so that's been a challenge for me, which I try to make up for by getting out and talking to people in person as much as I can.
And you do speak at conferences regularly. Actually, when you came out to California, you had just spoken at a conference. And from what I understand, the organization was actually going way back to the beginning of the organic movement as well.
Well, back to the modern organic movement, the early 70s. I kind of give a bit of the backstory of how the organic movement evolved in my book. And Acres USA is the organization that sponsored this conference that I was at, and is a bit of an anomaly amongst the radical 60s back to the land origins of the modern organic movement, in that it came out of the prairie populist tradition and the heartland of the U.S., not the liberal coasts and had a very different sort of political orientation than most of us radical activists from the 60s tradition who picked up the organic banner in the late 60s and early 70s. But I found that group to be extremely welcoming and open-minded towards all kinds of diverging viewpoints, and they've supported people to say things that a lot of other people don't like, and they were happy to listen to what I had to say too. And even though many of those folks are extremely skeptical about government programs of any kind, they were also interested in being able to get a market to be able to convert from conventional grain production to something that wasn't going to kill them or the earth. And I found a very receptive audience there, even for some of my more sort of radical ideas.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're saying that more and more conventional farmers are actually also tired of, having to use pesticides and whatever else is being used, and realizing how it's affecting human health, soil health, the health of the planet, the whole thing. That's encouraging. But it's difficult, right, to change from conventional to organic?
Well, it's difficult in that it requires a change of mindset. And a good conventional farmer wouldn't find the change of management practices that difficult once they have the right orientation towards it, once they begin to think differently about producing food and begin to see things in a little bit more holistic way. That's a process. It's not something that, you wake up one morning and say, I'm going to make a lot of money by switching to organic, so let's do it. It takes a lot of reflection and thinking and challenging previously dogmatically offered beliefs.
From what I gather, and I think that was a little bit your reason behind writing this book too, when the standards were set and helping with the transition and all of that, you had a little bit different idea from what the law ended up, or the guidelines ended up being.
Well, the whole process of institutionalizing organic within USDA was a huge challenge, because the mindset there was certainly very different. But there also was and continues to be, and maybe is a growing contingent of those who think differently and who challenge the prevailing dogma. And the folks who recruited me to come there, I would say, are definitely of that orientation. They really wanted organic, as we understood it, to become institutionalized in a good way, and in a way that would reflect the values of the organic movement. And we did end up, it took like 7 years from the time that the law was passed in 1990 until we finally had a draft regulation that we felt okay about. I mean, the law had problems that we couldn't overcome, and that was, that's a whole other story. But we felt good about our draft, but it was undermined partly by having to go through the Office of Management and Budget, which really, I think, dealt it a death knell. But the activist community put the final nails in the coffin of what I consider to be the best possible regulation that we could get from that law. And so that's a large part of the story of the book. The regulation that came out and that we are living with now is still okay so far as it goes, but it has a lot of limitations. And one of them is that it is really based on a lot of prescriptive practice standards that say, this is what you have to do this, you have to measure it thus, you have to have so many, you have to use these materials and not those materials. And it is very prescriptive and limiting, and it doesn't allow for people to try things that may be a little bit in the gray area. So that's kind of the short explanation. The thing that's really bothers me is that it has become much, much more so even it was before the law about prohibited substances, and the question of whether it's natural or synthetic continues to be, a hot button issue, and synthetic is always bad and natural is always good, and nobody agrees on what those terms mean anyway. It's a bit of a nightmare, and it's really not what organic is about. Organic isn't about not using bad stuff. It's about doing what is most environmentally and ecologically good.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you were saying some pretty strong statements that the organic community really was the most difficult to deal with, or is the most against it, and you're talking about hate mail. I mean, you're even saying that the organic community kind of paved the way for people like Monsanto to kind of slide under the radar with their GMO labeling or not labeling things. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, we're still dealing with this, and I think people are beginning to understand a little bit about how the divisiveness within a fairly broad-based community, and in becoming broader-based community, has played into the hands of the real enemies of organic, if you will. And that goes on constantly, and that's sort of either or thinking. You're either for us or against us. If you agree with anybody who we have determined to be the enemy, then you must be the enemy also, kind of thinking. And I unfortunately, that's a bad habit of the left, and has been, it's probably true of the right as well, but somehow or other the left has really fallen prey over the years to that kind of what they call a circular firing squad. And really the problems have to do with Monsanto, and I'll use Monsanto as representative of the corporate agribusiness as usual approach. They have used that to their advantage. And at the time that the organic rules were first being drafted at the National Organic Program, it was also the time when GMOs were first being commercialized. And there was a very strong anti-GMO movement beginning, and I was part of that. It was one of my motivations also for coming to USDA, was to try to make sure that organic never included GMOs. And
thank you for that. That would be a real mess.
Thank you. But somehow the first proposed rule that I talked about, when it was drafted and approved all the way through the various agencies and all the way up the top of USDA, did prohibit any use of GMOs or irradiation, which is another big issue, in organic production. That was one of the provisions that the Office of Management and Budget took out. We forced us to take out before it was published. And that was largely probably Monsanto's doing. They were probably the only ones who even realized that we existed at that point. We were very low-key and tiny. And so they won that battle, but with a huge firestorm that erupted in the community and the public when that proposal was published, where we asked for public comment about GMOs and irradiation, even though the regulations were silent about it and neither prohibited nor allowed it. And we got what we expected, a huge response. And when the public comment period was going on and the handwriting on the wall about that was clear, Monsanto kind of changed their tune, and they said, oh yeah, we agree. If people prefer not to consume GMOs, that they should have an alternative, and organic should be that alternative. And so we think that you should be very strict and keep the rules as pure as possible, and anybody who doesn't want GMOs can buy organic. And that effectively cut off any push that was out there in the community to require that GMOs be labeled, because now there could be an alternative. People didn't have to know if GMOs were in everything else. So that's just my stories.
Yeah, it's sometimes really interesting to hear how certain political actions get turned around into a very different direction. You know, it's just so interesting to me to hear about those correlations or effects. And it also makes you feel like, oh, we are so easily manipulated as people, you know?
Yeah, that's true. And, I want to talk about one more thing that is one of my primary motivations for getting out and really talking as much as I can to people about this, because I think that there's been a lot of confusion that's been created over the years since the regulations were released, concern about, large corporate agribusiness is turning organic into just another marketing label, and it's not really organic, and they're corrupt, and they're et cetera, all of these bad things. And that, organic farming doesn't mean anything anymore. So I want to try to dispel that idea that organic farming doesn't mean anything anymore, and also argue that we need to encourage as many as possible acres and farmers and eaters to get organic food. And it's not the only way, but in this age of certainly the election results that we've had and climate change deniers and in control of government, we really have to use every other means possible to begin to stop and reverse climate change. And one of the best ways to do that is by farming organically. And I don't care what you want to call it. If you don't want to sell it under an organic label, that's fine. But we need to build soil carbon. And that's one of the things that there are more and more studies that show organic farming builds soil carbon. Even the most lowest common denominator organic farming outperforms, conventional, even no-till GMO agriculture in terms of soil health. And that's what builds soil carbon. And the fact that nitrogen fertilizer manufacture and dispersal is one of the leading emitters of greenhouse gases. So changing the food system and changing the way we do agriculture would have a very significant impact on helping halt and slow climate change. It doesn't require huge investments of money or huge technological innovations. It just requires that people learn how to think differently, and that may be a huge hurdle, but it's one that I'm still quite dedicated to attempting. And, there's no guarantee that it's going to succeed, but I've got to do what I can for the sake of survival of the species, really.
I think there are more and more people which are understanding how the food we eat, the air we breathe, everything around us affects our health dramatically. And we see so many people getting sick. So there might be a lot of people which might not want to go with the USDA organic, just because one thing I was always wondering about is that each item on a farm has to be certified instead of the whole farm, which increases the cost and so forth. But I think there are other movements out there saying, okay, ask your farmer, find out, stuff like that. I'm
not sure what you mean by each item on the farm has to be certified.
From what I understand, when I asked farmers at the farmers market, like there are organic farms which maybe only bring 8 different items to the market. And they say they can't grow a wider variety because they have to pay a separate fee for each item they want to grow. So there is not the organic certification for the farm, but they get carrots, beets, lettuce, whatever certified.
That's highly inaccurate. I don't think you maybe misunderstand what they're saying, or they're dealing with a certifier who charges in a strange way. I mean, they all set their own fees. There's about 100 different certifiers worldwide, and they can set fees however they want as long as they're reasonable. So I don't know how that doesn't have anything to do with what the standards require.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that it was independent businesses. I thought it was, a government agent who would come, somebody's salary.
No.
Okay. That's good information.
No, I still do organic certification work as an independent contractor, as an inspector, and I work for one of the larger certifying agents, and they all have different structures. There's some that are state programs, some that are nonprofits, and a few that are for-profits. And
interesting. Yeah, so learned even more. And I read your whole book, so learned something else. Interesting.
Yeah.
So there are a couple more things, or like 3 more things I wanted to ask you about from your book. One of them is, and we don't have to talk very deeply about that, but you mentioned threat and boron and him trying to treat himself.
Oh.
Do you want to just briefly talk about that, because I thought that was very fascinating.
Well, that was a story about a fellow who used to be a well-respected farm consultant in my part of Vermont, which is called the Northeast Kingdom, and it's a kind of the rural backwater of a rural state where there's still the renegade outlaw mentality to a large extent. And Fred Franklin was of that ilk. Very much, he's the person who first turned me on to Acres USA and a lot of the very valuable learning and knowledge from that source. And he was very much strictly about mineral balancing and had secret formulas for products that need to be applied to the land. And he, unfortunately, would seize on something that was the miracle cure-all for everything. And in this particular case, he was advocating boron, which is a trace element. It's not a mineral, actually. It's a stuff. It is stuff that's mined from the ground, but it doesn't behave like a metal mineral. Anyway, it is an important trace mineral, but like any trace mineral, it can be toxic in excess. And he actually started taking it as a health aid, and I think he was actually pretty sick at the time already. So I don't really know the details of what actually killed him, but he was diagnosed as having a toxic boron overload and died shortly afterwards. And it's instructive because of the tendency for a lot of our organic and food and health advocates to look for silver bullets. This is the one nutrient that everybody is deficient in, and if we just all take supplements in this particular thing, we'll be healthy. And similar kinds of silver bullet approaches are popular for soil and lots of other things. And the moral of the story is there is no silver bullet. It's something that I still, have those kinds of, arguments, but discussions about where the emphasis belongs and so forth. And it really needs to be a very individual, site-specific, context-specific issue. There isn't one formula or one prescription that works everywhere for everyone. That's what organic really should be about.
That makes sense. That it's really, you have said it more than once, said a healthy soil needs to be built, not throw one item at your soil or at your garden, and that's going to take care of everything for sure. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I was really, very curious about that. So at one point you said you had 2.5 acres of a market garden. And I was wondering, did you and your husband work that by yourself, or did you have people helping you? Because that just seems like an awful lot of work to me.
Well, it's less work where we have long winters. Let me put it that way.
Okay, that's true. You get to, because I'm looking out and it's like, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that.
Yeah,
and
hey, well, I'm looking out here and everything is covered with snow. I don't have to do anything out there. Except
I need
firewood.
to plant. I need to start seeds. I need to, do all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, 2.5 acres isn't all that much around here. I mean, it's pretty substantial, and we occasionally would hire some teenagers to help us with a few things, but really it was the two of us, and mostly full time in the summers, and it varied between us, and we didn't have a lot of mechanization either at that time, so we did a lot by hand.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sitting on 1/3 of an acre and I never seem to get around to do everything I want to do. So maybe I just want to do too much. I admit that.
Yeah, well, I'm in that same boat at this point. I mean, I have a good sized vegetable garden. I live next door to the incredible farming family that has now turned my 2.5 acre market garden into a 20 acre produce operation, and wonder why I'm growing my own vegetables still.
Well, gardening is a form of therapy. There is no question about
Absolutely.
that. Just to do a shout out to everybody. Everybody can grow something. I just feel it's so important to get in touch with our food, to know that a plant actually grows out of a little seed into this big amazing thing to eat. So, Grace, how can people, and I want to say something else about Grace's book. So we talked a lot about Washington and the regulations and all of that, but it's actually also a little romance novel in there. So, so that part of the reader gets some satisfaction too. And Grace has been living in a lot of different places and circumstances. And, for example, as a kid, she was in Israel with her parents. I kind of think that might have brought your mind towards all that garden stuff too. You were in a kibbutz then, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And living cooperations in Jamaica, living very poorly, and then coming to Washington, D.C., which is this huge city environment.
Yes.
And, so really a lot of really interesting life ways. So if you fear this is going to be really dry and it's all about regulation, it's not. It's a very interesting read. And Grace, how can people buy your book?
Well,
what do they have to do?
You can go to my website and click on the Buy Now button, and the website is www.organic-revolutionary.com. And it's also available through Acres USA, is now in the Fedco Seeds catalog. If you don't remember any of that, you can go to Amazon and find it. But, I try to get people to go to my website and order it. It is now available as an ebook. And if you go to the website and sign up for my newsletter, which I put out once a month, and I blog and all of that stuff. I'm learning to be a social media person.
Excellent.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter.
I didn't know you're on there, so I will follow you for sure. And I'm going to link to all your information in our show notes, which appear on iTunes, but we also have a blog. So, and I have the link to our website there. So I'm going to link to everything, how you can get a hold of Grace. And just for those of you which don't know, if you buy a book on Amazon, the author gets very little offset money. And so the best way is always to buy directly from the author if you have that opportunity.
I will point out that this is self-published. So the expenses and everything else all comes directly out of my own resources. But it's not a money maker. It's out there so that people can talk about it and maybe learn something and maybe think differently.
Thank you so much, Grace. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for coming and spending time with me on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Marianne. I appreciate all that you're doing, and also very much enjoyed meeting you and spending a little time out there in sunny Southern California.
Not sunny today. We have rain. Yay!
Yay.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you so much for listening to our show, and I hope you enjoyed what Grace had to tell you. I highly recommend you get this book just because it's such a big topic, and I feel the book gave me a different understanding of what the organic movement is all about and why it is important for us to care. I already cared, as you know. That's a lot what our podcast is all about. But I got information I did not have before. And I feel it's very important to support authors as well. So if you can, please buy from Grace directly. Now, very quickly, we of course like for you to come to our website and check out the blog, and you will find all the links of things we talked about on our blog. And do join us on Facebook. It's a Sustainable Living Podcast. We have a page there, and then we also have a Facebook group. I would like to address today another topic very briefly, and I will play a promo right in the middle here, or maybe at the end, for somebody who has become a friend of mine. We have not met in person yet, just via social media, and we are getting to know each other a lot too through our podcasts, because I feel we do share of ourselves, and you probably know that for me, people I listen to on a regular basis, they almost become my friends. So I'm talking about Big D right now, and he has a podcast called the Memoir Survival Podcast to the Galaxy. And he talks a lot about mental health issues and depression. And as I was talking to Grace and now editing the podcast, I kept thinking about the connection of food and health, including mental health. And I truly believe that there is a connection between our food not being as nutritious as it used to be, and very highly processed, and many other factors, including the whole GMO issue. So I thought it was appropriate to play it in this episode when we are talking about building soil, having a healthy soil with all the minerals and elements available in it, having food which is free of pesticides and herbicides into our body and free of GMO. And so I thought I want to give Big D a big shout out and play his promo. And I hope you will check out his show as well. Hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful week and tune in again. Actually, for a little while, you might be getting 2 episodes a week. Janice and I have been talking about it. No promises. It's mostly me who takes a long time to edit, but we have so many interesting interviews already recorded, and I would love to bring them to you. And as you know, I have a name problem, so of course I pronounce the podcast wrong. It's the Memoir Survival Guide to the Galaxy podcast. And to tell you the truth, my editing skills are not that wonderful yet, so I just couldn't figure out how to cut it out and put the right one in. That comes next month, maybe. I've come a long ways, baby. So please listen to his promo, and please listen to his podcast.
Join me, Big D, for the Mailman Survival Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast with a silly name that tackles the serious subject of mental health. Twice a month, I chronicle my personal struggle with depression, anxiety, and sensory processing disorder, as well as doing insightful and thought-provoking interviews with both professionals and lay people. Along the way, I provide tools and tricks you can use in your daily life to help with your struggles and to provide hope for the future. You can find new podcasts, previous episodes, helpful blogs and articles all on my website at mmsurvivalguide.weebly.com. And remember, you are not alone.